Hey there! Welcome to part 1 of my micro-lecture series on plant biology. The information included in these talks is from several textbooks which I've cited in the video description, as well as my own knowledge I've gained over the years. Over this series, I'd like to work all the way up to how plants function as a whole, but we'll have to start pretty small to get a good, cohesive understanding of that. So, without further ado, let's get started with the smallest unit of plant life, the cell. Plant cells and animal cells have many things in common. You've likely heard enough about animal cells in your biology class, as well as the Golgi apparatus and the endoplasmic reticulum, and plenty about the nucleus, I hope. Plant cells have most all the things that animal cells do, with a few added features. Let's refresh your memory on some of these plant peculiarities. First off, you'll see from my approximation that, generally speaking, plant cells are larger than animal cells. They also typically have chloroplasts in a single, large vacuole that takes up to 90% of total cell volume. The cell wall is also something plant cells have, while animal cells do not. Plant cells can also have other specialized organelles and other characteristics, but we usually like to focus on these 4, as they're the most common differences. We'll look at organelles first. These are specialized structures within the cell which perform a variety of functions. They're literally little organs. Plastids are organelles that are surrounded by double membranes, their purpose being to produce and store pigments, which capture, reflect, and utilize different wavelengths of light, and then food. Remember, we're at the cellular level here, so their foods aren't like chunks of meat, they're starches, oils, and proteins at a very small scale. There are 2 main groups of plastids, leucoplasts, which contain no pigment and are mainly used to store starches and oils, and chromoplasts, which do contain pigments. Chloroplasts belong to the second group as they contain the pigment chlorophyll, a green pigment. They're also the site of photosynthesis, where, with the help of chlorophyll, plants capture sunlight and convert it to sugars. They do this by taking the sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water and converting them into a sugar called glucose, the byproduct being oxygen. I'd like to get more in depth with photosynthesis and cell energy later, but for now, that's all we'll cover in this micro-lecture. Now, I didn't originally mention mitochondria in our introduction, since animal cells also have them. Y'all also know it's the powerhouse of the cell. But I'd like to take a moment so we can incorporate what we learned with the chloroplast and look at the big picture of cell energy. Again, I'll likely do a video later that's more in depth, but for now, let's just skim the basics. The mitochondrion, which is a singular form of the word, is a site of cellular respiration where it takes the glucose produced in the chloroplast and, with the help of oxygen, produces carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and this is the source of cellular energy for all life on Earth. I'd also like to point out that these 2 processes are opposites of each other. Carbon dioxide and water to glucose and oxygen, and back again to carbon dioxide and water. Still, we get sunlight to sugar to energy, disregarding the bouncing byproducts. Okay, so that was a lot. Let's take a little brain break. Vacuoles are a very simple concept. Think of those old-timey vacuum cleaners with the bags. The bag, in this case, is the tonoplast, the vacuolar membrane. Within the vacuole is cell sap, which contains pretty much anything. Waste, certain pigments, salt, food, which may also be digested in the vacuole, and most importantly, water. The vacuole controls water within the cell to accomplish a multitude of functions, including rapid movement, gaseous exchange, and turgidity, which is the opposite of wilting. And now we're talking about other cell features. So next, let's talk about the cytoplasm. I think there may be some misunderstanding out there about cytoplasm, and I'd like to clear that up first. I don't know about y'all, but I used to think that cytoplasm was the ooey gooey filling of the cell. This is not quite the case, however. The cytoplasm is everything outside the nucleus of the cell, but everything inside the cell membrane. This includes organelles, other than the nucleus, in addition to that ooey gooey filling, which is called cytosol. There are also ergastic substances in the cytoplasm, which is a fancy way of saying miscellaneous molecules of all kinds. Besides that, the cytoplasm is 80% water and aids in intracellular transport, that is, transporting materials within the cell. It's how sugar gets from the chloroplast to the mitochondrion. But we talked about the cell membrane and didn't really define it, so let's do that now. In plants, the cell, or plasma membrane, is referred to as the plasmalemma. Plasmalemma, quite fun to say. We keep offhandedly mentioning membranes this micro-lecture, but what are they? Let's look at the most important membrane in the cell and talk it out. A membrane starts with a phospholipid bilayer. A phospholipid is a specific molecule that has a hydrophilic head, which is water-loving, and a hydrophobic tail, which is water-hating. There are 2 of these tails. Because we've got water within and without the cell, the phospholipids naturally group together and protect these water-hating tails, forming the bilayer, with the tails in the center away from water. I'm going to show you a very overwhelming picture. Don't freak out. We're not going over everything in it. This is just to show you that the plasmalemma is more than just a phospholipid bilayer. It has many other components, such as channel and carrier proteins, which help transport substances into and out of the cell. If you've heard the term semi-permeable membrane, these are the controllers of that. They, with other features of the membrane, are dictating what's going inside the cell and what's going out of it. As always, I could get much more into the specifics, but let's move on and save the particulars of membranes for another day. Now, I'd like to define the protoplast briefly, since we will be revisiting it in the future. You'll hear this word used in a few different contexts, but the two main definitions are a cell whose cell wall has been removed, and the cell excluding the cell wall. There are some other definitions, notably from the Concise Oxford Dictionary of Botany, which defines the protoplast as the part of the cell that has active metabolic processes. That's really the only other place I found that definition, so I'd like to point out that while it's very likely just as applicable, perhaps it should be the last wording you think of when defining this, especially if you're watching these micro lectures to help study for a test. Luckily, our last cell feature is much more straightforward, and it is the cell wall itself. It protects the plant cell and gives it its strength, rigidity, and structure. The cell wall is mainly composed of cellulose, hemicellulose, and pectin. I'd like to talk about pectin and the middle lamella during the next microlecture of the series, so for now let's focus on cellulose and hemicellulose. Many textbooks are pretty hard-pressed to contain useful details on these, so I've gotten this information from pedia.com, the link of which I've included on the slide and in the video description. Cellulose microfibrils make up the majority of the cell wall and are made up of long, strong, singular chains of polysaccharides, which are a type of carbohydrate. Hemicellulose is a simpler form of cellulose with a weaker, shorter structure. Lignin may also be found in the cell wall, and this substance will greatly harden the cell wall, making it even more rigid and inflexible. Lignification will be a key process in our future talks, so please keep it in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that the cell wall is considered non-living. However, after that, we're done. I hope it wasn't too painful and you learned something new. Please let me know if there's a topic you'd like me to go over in more detail, and until then, remember to wear your mask, social distance, and/or get vaccinated for yourself, your friends, and your family's safety.